Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the American West. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing what places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the spring of 1884, the body of John King Fisher was laid to rest in the dusty soil of Uvalde County, Texas. The official account stated that he had been shot in a theater in San Antonio on March 11th of that year. A simple case of frontier justice, or so it seemed. But in 1967, when local historian Thomas Burrell began organizing county records for the Uvalde Historical Society, he discovered a series of discrepancies that would call the entire narrative into question. Burrell's research was never published. 3 months after beginning his work, he abruptly abandoned the project and refused to discuss it further. The materials he collected were filed away and largely forgotten until a courthouse renovation in 1962 unearthed them again. The circumstances of King Fisher's life and death present a disturbing puzzle. How did a notorious outlaw transform into a respected lawman? What forces shaped the man who would leave such a dark imprint on the Texas frontier? And why did so many who investigated his story eventually fall silent? King Fisher was born in 1854 in Collin County, Texas. His mother died when he was 2 years old, leaving him in the care of a father who remarried quickly. County records indicate his father, Job Fisher, was a quiet man who kept to himself. Neighbors rarely saw the family together. The few existing school records describe young King as withdrawn but capable. A teacher's note from 1865 mentions that the boy shows little emotion even when provoked. Another entry dated October 1866 states, "King displays an unusual fascination with animal anatomy. His drawings, while technically proficient, are disturbing in their detail and focus on internal structures." The school principal had apparently requested a meeting with Job Fisher regarding these concerns, but county records show the father never appeared. Town physician Dr. William Hargrove noted in his private journal an encounter with young King in the autumn of 1866, treated the Fisher boy today for a laceration on his right palm. When questioned about the injury, he claimed to have been testing something. Most peculiar was his complete lack of distress, despite the wound being quite deep. He watched with clinical interest as I stitched the cut, asking detailed questions about the procedure. Before leaving, he asked if I had ever seen the inside of a person while they were still alive. I found myself unable to sleep after this consultation. The Fisher family lived in a 2-story farmhouse set back from the main road, partially obscured by a stand of cottonwoods. The nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. Isolation defined young King's existence. His stepmother, Sarah, rarely ventured into town. When she did, people noted she spoke little and kept her gaze downward. Parish records show she stopped attending church entirely after 1867. The local minister, Reverend James Thornton, noted in his personal journal that he had visited the Fisher home in the winter of that year. His entry is brief but telling. Called upon the Fisher household today. The woman appears unwell, though she denies any ailment. The house is immaculate, yet somehow unwelcoming. Young King watched me from the staircase throughout my visit, never blinking, never speaking. I find I cannot recall Job saying a single word during the entire hour of my stay. I shall not return unless summoned. A subsequent entry in Thornton's journal, dated January 1868, mentions receiving a letter from Sarah Fisher requesting he return to the house to discuss a matter of spiritual urgency. Thornton wrote, "Mrs. Fisher's letter contained disturbing allusions to noises from below and Job's obsession with the cellar. She asked specifically if the church recognized methods for containing evil beyond prayer. I responded with an offer to visit, but received no reply. 3 weeks later, I encountered her in town. When I mentioned her letter, she claimed no knowledge of it. Her hands trembled violently throughout our conversation. Before departing, she whispered, "He listens when we speak of it." Even now, he might be listening. I could not determine if she meant her husband or the boy. In the fall of 1868, several farm animals belonging to neighboring properties went missing. Marcus Holcomb, who owned the closest farm to the Fishers, reported finding the partial remains of one of his calves in a clearing near the property line. In his statement to the county sheriff, he noted, "The animal wasn't killed by any predator I've ever seen. It was cut up, precise-like, with some kind of blade. Parts were missing, the heart, the liver. What troubled me most was finding a child's footprint in the mud nearby." No official investigation followed. In the winter of 1869, something changed in the Fisher household. Tax records show Job Fisher sold off 40 acres of land suddenly and without explanation. A shopkeeper's ledger from that period contains an unusual entry. J. Fisher, lock, chain, timber, cash. No purpose was specified for these items. That same month, neighbors reported hearing prolonged hammering from the direction of the Fisher property. Marcus Holcomb, whose farm lay closest to the Fishers, later told the county sheriff that the sounds continued for 3 nights. Not regular hammering like building, he reportedly said, more like someone trying not to be heard, stopping and starting. Always after midnight. A traveling peddler named Simon Greaves, who visited the area in late January 1870, later provided a troubling account to the McKinney Examiner newspaper. "I approached the Fisher place seeking to sell my wares. Before I reached the house, the boy appeared at the edge of the property. He couldn't have been more than 15, but something in his manner made me halt. 'You can't come any closer,' he said. 'Father's working.' When I asked what work required such privacy, the boy smiled in a way that chilled me. 'He's building a box for Mother,' he said. 'She's not dead yet, but he says she will be soon.' I left without another word. Some sales aren't worth making." King, then 15, began spending more time away from home. He took odd jobs in town, often sleeping in stables rather than returning to the family farm. A local blacksmith, Samuel Weathers, later recalled, "The boy would sit for hours just watching the fire, never asked questions, never spoke unless spoken to, had the coldest eyes I ever saw on a youngster." Weathers also noted that King once requested to borrow a set of metal tools, including a small saw and several long iron picks. When asked their purpose, the boy reportedly replied, "My father has something that needs opening." Weathers declined to lend the tools. Martha Jenkins, who operated the local boarding house, recorded in her guest register an unusual note in February 1870. Young Fisher stayed 3 nights, paid with silver coins that appeared very old, Spanish, I believe, would not speak of his home situation. Other boarders complained of hearing him talking in his room late at night, though I observed no visitors. Upon cleaning the room after his departure, found strange markings carved into the underside of the bed frame, circles within circles, and what appeared to be names written in a cramped hand. The markings have since been painted over. The town doctor, William Chambers, recorded in his daybook a visit to the Fisher property in January 1870. The purpose of the call was not specified, but he wrote, "Patient refuses examination. J insists all is well. The odor in the house is overwhelming, like meat left too long in summer heat. The cellar door has been secured with multiple locks. When I inquired about this unusual precaution, I was informed they had a problem with things getting out. I offered to examine Mrs. Fisher, who appears extremely gaunt and speaks in whispers, but was firmly refused." A subsequent entry in Chambers' daybook, dated February 8, 1870, indicates he was summoned to the Fisher property again. Called to the Fisher home before dawn, found the house in disarray. Jay claims his wife suffered an accident, fell down the cellar stairs. The woman was unconscious, with multiple contusions and a peculiar wound on her throat that Jay could not adequately explain. When I suggested moving her to my surgery in town, Jay became agitated. The boy watched from the doorway, expressionless. Most disturbing was Jay's insistence that I not document this visit in my official records. He pressed a gold coin into my hand, Spanish, quite old, and said, "Some things are better forgotten, doctor." The look in his eyes persuaded me to comply, though I make this private notation for my own conscience. By February 1870, King had left home entirely. He drifted south, working as a ranch hand. When questioned about his family, he would simply state, "They're gone now." No record exists of what happened to Job and Sarah Fisher. Their names disappear from all county documents after February 1870. The family property was eventually claimed by the county for unpaid taxes. When officials finally visited the farmhouse in 1871, they found it empty and in disrepair. The cellar door had been secured with a heavy chain and padlock. The county assessor noted it was nailed shut from the outside and further sealed with what appears to be tar or pitch along all edges. No one bothered to open it. A curious notation appears in Sheriff Thomas Blackwell's personal logbook for March 1871. It reads simply, "Fisher Place. Terrible smell. No bodies found. Dog refused to enter cellar. Matter closed." No official report was ever filed. During the property auction in April 1871, an incident occurred that was briefly mentioned in the McKinney Examiner. The article states, "Proceedings at the Fisher property auction were disrupted when workers attempting to access the cellar for inventory purposes reported hearing what they described as scratching sounds from behind the sealed door. County Judge Williams ordered the cellar remain unopened, citing safety concerns regarding possible structural damage. The property sold for considerably less than its assessed value to Mr. Ezekiel Thornton, who plans to demolish the existing structures. Thornton, however, never completed the demolition. County records show he visited the property only once after purchase. He sold the land 3 months later at a significant loss and reportedly left the state. The new owner, a cattle company based in Fort Worth, allowed the house to decay naturally. By 1875, local papers reported it had partially collapsed. No mention was made of whether the cellar was ever opened. King Fisher's transformation began in the vast, unforgiving landscape of South Texas. In the brush country of the Nueces Strip, he found work as a cowhand, but soon fell in with rustlers operating along the Mexican border. The Nueces Strip, that lawless stretch between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande, was perfect for a man seeking to disappear. During this period, Fisher worked for various ranchers, learning the terrain and establishing connections with both American and Mexican outlaws who operated in the borderlands. Domingo Sanchez, who worked alongside Fisher at the Coleman Ranch in 1872, later provided a rare glimpse into this period. El Rey, that's what the Mexican hands called him, the King, not because of his name, but because of how he carried himself. He never raised his voice, never had to. Men twice his age would fall silent when he looked at them. He kept a small book where he wrote names. No one knew why. Once a hand named Miguel made a joke about it. The next day Miguel was gone. His horse remained in the corral, but the man himself was never seen again. After that, no one mentioned the book. Joseph McCombs, foreman at the Coleman Ranch during this period, noted in his personal journal an unsettling incident involving Fisher. Found young Fisher today at the North Creek, kneeling beside the body of a coyote. At first, I thought he had shot the animal, but upon closer inspection, I observed the creature had been carefully dissected, its organs arranged in a precise pattern on the ground. When questioned, Fisher claimed to be studying its insides. He showed no embarrassment or concern at being discovered in this act. Most troubling was his question, as he cleaned his knife. "Do you think animals have souls, Mr. McCombs?" I provided no answer, but found myself disinclined to turn my back on him afterward. By 1876, Fisher had established himself as the leader of a band operating out of a ranch in Dimmitt County. County records list multiple complaints against Fisher and his men, but few witnesses were willing to testify. Those who did often changed their statements or disappeared before trials could proceed. The ranch, located in one of the most isolated parts of the county, became his headquarters. He named it Rancho del Silencio, Ranch of Silence, though this name appears on no official documents. A Texas Ranger report from 1877 describes Fisher as a man of medium height with a peculiar intensity to his manner. He speaks rarely, but when he does, others listen. The same report notes that local settlers fear him not for what he has done, but for what they believe he is capable of. The report's author, Ranger James Brooks, added a personal observation. I have encountered numerous outlaws and criminals in my 15 years of service. Most are predictable in their violence and cruelty. Fisher is different. There is a calculation to him, a patience that is far more unsettling than common brutality. He watches and waits, and one gets the impression that whatever violence he commits is merely a means to some other, undisclosed end. Brooks's official report contains details about Fisher's operation, but makes no mention of his most disturbing discovery. In a private letter to his superior, Captain Leander McNelly, Brooks wrote, "I must confide something not included in my official documentation. While surveying Fisher's property from a nearby ridge, I observed through my field glass a peculiar structure behind the main house. Resembling a low stone hut with no windows, it appeared to be secured with multiple locks. More alarming was what I witnessed at dusk. Fisher emerged from this structure, his clothing disheveled, his hands darkened with what appeared to be blood. He proceeded to a water trough where he washed thoroughly, then changed his garments, burning the soiled clothing immediately. Throughout this procedure, his expression remained impassive, as if he had completed nothing more significant than feeding livestock. I cannot account for what occurs in that stone building, but I find myself reluctant to approach the property again after nightfall." Fisher was known to sit alone for hours on the porch of his ranch house, watching the horizon with a rifle across his lap. According to one of his former men, who spoke to a San Antonio newspaper in 1892 on condition of anonymity, Fisher maintained strict rules at the ranch. No one rode out alone. No one went into town without permission. At night, all hands stayed in the bunkhouse, which he kept locked from the outside until morning. When asked why they tolerated such conditions, the man replied, "You don't understand. We weren't being kept in. Something was being kept out." The same informant described Fisher's peculiar habit of marking his territory. Every quarter mile around the property perimeter, he drove iron stakes into the ground. Each stake had strange symbols carved into it. He'd visit these markers monthly, usually at the new moon, and refresh whatever he'd painted on them. None of us ever got close enough to see what it was. One of the Mexican hands claimed it was blood. Another said it was something worse. All I know is the local coyotes would never cross that line. Neither would the Indians. They said the ground there was sick. The Dimmitt County ranch became known locally as the Silent House. Even among his own men, Fisher enforced an unusual degree of quiet. A former gang member, interviewed years later, claimed, "King couldn't abide loud talking or laughing, said it disturbed his thinking. Men who couldn't keep their voices down didn't last long in his outfit. They'd just not be there one morning." The same man reported that Fisher had established a peculiar routine. Every new moon he'd ride out alone, always to the north. He'd be gone 2 days, sometimes 3. No one knew where he went. When he returned, he'd lock himself in his room for a day. We could hear him talking, though there was never anyone else in there. Talking and sometimes what sounded like crying. Ezekiel Martinez, who briefly worked as a cook at the ranch in 1877, later told a Catholic priest in Eagle Pass about a disturbing discovery. "I was searching the storeroom for dried chilies when I found a small wooden box hidden behind some flour sacks. Inside were 5 small leather pouches. Each contained what appeared to be human teeth, all molars. Each pouch was labeled with a name and a date. I recognized one name as belonging to a hand who had disappeared the previous month. When Fisher discovered me with the box, he did not threaten or deny. He simply said, 'Everyone leaves something behind, Ezekiel. I just keep better track of it than most.' I left that night and rode 30 miles before stopping." What truly happened at the ranch remains largely unrecorded. Local authorities rarely ventured onto Fisher's property. Rumors circulated about travelers who disappeared after taking the wrong trail past his land. Official reports listed such disappearances as lost in the brush country, a common fate in the harsh terrain. No bodies were ever recovered. A Mexican vaquero named Eduardo Vasquez, who briefly worked for Fisher in 1875, later told a priest in Piedras Negras that there was a room in the ranch house that remained permanently locked. Only El Rey had the key, Vasquez said. Once, while he was away, two of the Americans tried to break open the door. They were curious, you understand? That night, while everyone was asleep, I heard someone moving through the bunkhouse, not walking like a normal man, more like dragging something heavy. In the morning, the two men were gone. Their bedrolls remained, but they had vanished. El Rey returned that afternoon. He went straight to the locked room. When he came out, he looked at us all and said, "The room is hungry. Who's next?" No one ever approached that door again. A traveling photographer, Gilbert Wilson, visited the area in 1878 and later published an account in the San Antonio Express. Wilson had been hired to document ranches for Eastern investors and claimed to have spent one night at Fisher's property. "I was received with neither hostility nor welcome," he wrote. Fisher permitted me to photograph the exterior of the main house, but firmly refused access to certain areas of the property. Most curious was his reaction when I inquired about a small stone structure visible from my assigned quarters. "That building doesn't exist," he informed me, despite it being clearly visible not 50 yards away. During the night, I was awakened by what sounded like singing, a low, monotonous chant coming from the direction of that same structure. When I rose to investigate, I found Fisher standing outside my door. "Bad dreams," he said, though I had made no noise. "The night air here plays tricks. Best to stay inside until morning." I departed at first light and did not include the property in my portfolio. In the spring of 1876, something occurred that changed the course of Fisher's life again. A handwritten letter found among his personal effects after his death, never mailed and addressed only to J, contains a single paragraph. "What was done cannot be undone. I hear them at night now, moving under the floorboards. You were right about the consequences. I should have listened." The paper shows signs of having been crumpled and then smoothed out repeatedly, as if the writer had changed his mind several times about discarding it. During this same period, the ranch experienced what Fisher's men later described as a disturbance. No clear account exists of what transpired, but county records mention a fire that destroyed part of the main house. Suspiciously, Fisher made no insurance claim, nor did he report the incident to authorities. One of his men later claimed that Fisher had deliberately set the fire himself, specifically in the wing containing the mysterious locked room. "After it burned," the man recalled, "he had us dig a pit 20 feet deep. Whatever remained in that room, he buried it, made us fill the hole with salt before covering it with earth. Then he built a new house, smaller, 100 yards from the original foundation. He never set foot near the old site again." Another account came from a ranch hand known only as Clayton, who gave a statement to a Catholic priest in Carrizo Springs shortly before his death in 1883. The priest recorded, "The dying man wished to unburden his soul regarding events at the Fisher Ranch. He claimed to have been one of the men ordered to dig the pit after the fire. According to Clayton, they found something in the burned room, a small iron cage, its bars warped by heat, but still intact. Inside was what he described as a collection of bones, not all of them human, arranged in a pattern. Fisher ordered these remains placed in the pit first, followed by the cage itself. Most disturbing was Clayton's claim that as they worked, he distinctly heard whispering coming from the bones. Before covering the pit, Fisher poured what Clayton described as a small fortune in silver coins into it, followed by several bags of salt. When asked why he had included the silver, Fisher reportedly replied, "Payment for services rendered." Clayton fled the ranch the following day. Shortly after these events, Fisher rode into Uvalde and surrendered to Sheriff N.L. Stratton. No specific charges were filed, but within 6 months, in a turn of events that baffled many, King Fisher was appointed Deputy Sheriff of Uvalde County. The very man who had terrorized the region was now enforcing its laws. Those who knew Fisher during this period described a marked change in his demeanor. He became meticulous about his appearance, wearing clean, pressed clothing and keeping his hair neatly trimmed. He spoke more frequently, but still chose his words with unusual care. One courthouse clerk noted he would stand perfectly still while listening, like a hunting animal, never fidgeted, never blinked more than necessary. Another county employee observed that Fisher had developed the habit of writing in a small notebook throughout the day. Names mostly, the man recalled. He kept lists of people who passed through town, said it was official business, but I never saw those lists in any county records. A local newspaper, the Uvalde Sentinel, published a profile of Fisher in December 1879, portraying his transformation as a redemption story. The article described him as a reformed character who has exchanged the wild ways of his youth for the responsibilities of law enforcement. It noted his effectiveness in reducing cattle theft and maintaining order in the county. Unmentioned was the fact that criminal activities in the area had indeed declined sharply, not through arrests and prosecutions, but because other outlaws seemed to avoid Uvalde County entirely, while Fisher served as deputy. The newspaper editor, Thomas Warren, later confided to a colleague from the San Antonio Express that the article had been heavily edited at Fisher's insistence. Warren's original draft had included questions about Fisher's sudden career change and mentioned local rumors about his continuing connection to his former ranch in Dimmitt County. Fisher visited my office the day before publication, Warren wrote. He suggested certain revisions in a manner that made it clear they were not optional. Most curious was his insistence that I remove any mention of his monthly absences from town. Some matters are private, he told me. Best for everyone if they stay that way. Fisher established himself in a small house on the outskirts of Uvalde. Unlike other lawmen who socialized in saloons and at community gatherings, Fisher kept to himself when not performing his duties. His house remained sparsely furnished. The only decorative item was a large mirror in the front room, positioned to reflect the door. A carpenter who installed shelving in the house in 1882 later commented on its unusual features. Most peculiar was the bedroom. The bed was positioned in the center of the room, not against any wall. Around it, on the floor, was a circle of some white substance, salt, I believe. When I asked about this arrangement, Deputy Fisher informed me it was an old Texas tradition and changed the subject. The same carpenter noted that Fisher had requested several modifications to the house. Additional locks on all doors and windows, a trapdoor in the kitchen floor leading to a small root cellar, and, most strangely, a system of bells attached to thin wires that ran along the perimeter of the property. For warning, Fisher had explained without elaboration. Sheriff Stratton's personal diary, discovered among his effects after his death, contained several entries regarding Fisher. One, dated March 1880, reads, "Fisher requested leave again, third time this year. Always coinciding with the new moon. Claims personal business. Returns looking haggard, as if he hasn't slept. Noticed fresh soil on his boots today?" When questioned, he mentioned visiting his family property up north. County records show he has no living relatives nor property holdings in his name. Something isn't right, but his work remains exemplary. The county has never been more peaceful. A subsequent entry, dated July 1880, shows increasing concern. Fisher's absences continue. Last night, Wilkins at the livery reported Fisher returned well after midnight, his horse exhausted as if from a long journey. Impossible for him to have gone to Dimmitt County and back in that time. More concerning is the small leather pouch he now wears around his neck. When I inquired about it, he claimed it contains protection. Against what, he would not say. Have noticed he touches it before entering certain buildings or approaching particular individuals. The man has his eccentricities, but he keeps the peace better than any deputy I've known. In 1881, Fisher married Sarah Vivian. Little is known about their courtship. Town records indicate she was a widow who had recently arrived from East Texas. No family attended their wedding. The ceremony was brief, with minimal witnesses. Those who visited the Fisher home after the marriage noted that Sarah seemed perpetually nervous, starting at small sounds and rarely engaging in conversation. Myra Jenkins, who worked briefly as a housekeeper for the Fishers in 1882, later told her daughter about the strange household. Mrs. Fisher never smiled, Jenkins recalled. She watched her husband constantly, like she was waiting for him to give her permission to breathe. There were rules in that house that made no sense. No whistling, no humming. Certain rooms couldn't be entered on certain days. The deputy had her taste all his food before he would eat it, like he feared poison. Most peculiar was how they slept. She told me he made her tie a rope from her wrist to his each night. "So I'll know if you get up," he told her. I left that position after 2 weeks. Couldn't bear the heaviness in that house. Jenkins also described finding a curious item while cleaning. In the back of a kitchen drawer, wrapped in cloth, was a small box made of bone. Human finger bones, I believe, though I pray I'm mistaken. Inside were 5 human teeth, each wrapped in a scrap of paper with a name written on it. I replaced it exactly as found and never mentioned it. Some things are better not known. A local physician's records from 1882 mentioned treating Sarah Fisher for nervous exhaustion. The doctor noted, "Patient claims to hear someone walking in the attic at night. Upon examination, the house has no attic. Prescribed laudanum for sleep." In a follow-up entry, he wrote, "Mrs. Fisher returned, appearing even more distressed. Claims to have found unfamiliar footprints in the dust of their root cellar. Too narrow to be human of heart," in her words. Husband dismisses her concerns as female hysteria, though I note he has installed additional locks on the cellar door. Have increased laudanum dosage. Sarah made no further visits to the doctor. Neighbors reported seeing her less and less frequently. The physician, Dr. James Henderson, recorded a private note in his personal journal rather than his official medical records. "I fear for Mrs. Fisher's safety, though I have no concrete evidence of mistreatment. During her last visit, I observed faint bruising around her wrists, consistent with restraints. When questioned, she claimed to have done it to herself during nightmares. What troubles me most was her statement, as she was leaving, 'Doctor, if something happens to me, don't let them bury me in the dark. Promise me that much.' Before I could respond, Deputy Fisher appeared in the doorway, though I had not seen him enter my building. The look that passed between husband and wife was one I shall not soon forget. Her terror, his cold assessment. I find myself reluctant to pursue the matter further." Town gossip suggested that the marriage was troubled from the beginning. Elvira Simmons, who operated a boarding house across from the Fisher residence, told the Uvalde newspaper in 1883 that she often heard terrible rows coming from the house at night. "Not shouting," she clarified. "Something worse?" Long silences broken by what sounded like furniture being moved. Once I distinctly heard Mrs. Fisher cry out, "They're not real, King. They can't be real." After that, nothing but silence until morning. What was not included in the newspaper account was Simmons's description of what she observed the following day. In a statement given to Thomas Burrell during his 1967 investigation, Simmons's daughter shared her mother's full account. Mother said that after the disturbance, she watched the house from her window. Near dawn, she saw Fisher emerge, carrying something wrapped in a blanket to the small shed behind the house. He returned empty-handed. Mrs. Fisher did not appear in town for nearly 2 weeks afterward. When she did, she wore high-necked dresses despite the summer heat and spoke to no one. Mother always believed something terrible happened that night, but feared to report it. Fisher had eyes everywhere, she used to say. In December 1883, 3 months before Fisher's death, a cattle buyer from San Antonio stayed at the Fisher home while conducting business in Uvalde. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "Strangest household I've ever encountered. The walls seem to absorb sound. Mrs. Fisher speaks only when her husband looks directly at her. At dinner, I observed her waiting for him to taste each dish before she would touch her own food. When I retired for the night, I distinctly heard her weeping. though when I mentioned it at breakfast, Fisher stated that his wife had slept soundly through the night. I will be glad to conclude my business here. The cattle buyer, identified in county records as James Thornton, added a postscript. Fisher keeps a small book on his person at all times. This evening, while he stepped outside, curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced at it. It contained only names, dozens of them, many crossed out. My own name had been added to the last page. I did not sleep afterward. In the same letter, later recovered from Thornton's personal effects after his death, he described an unsettling incident that occurred during his stay. Last night, I woke to a strange sound, a scraping, as if something was moving across the floor of the room below mine. Looking out my window, I observed Fisher in the yard, digging by lantern light near the small shed. He worked with unusual urgency for nearly an hour, then placed something in the hole, something small that I could not clearly discern. After filling the hole, he knelt beside it for several minutes, his lips moving as if in prayer or incantation. When he rose and turned toward the house, I quickly moved from the window. This morning the disturbed earth had been carefully covered with straw, and Fisher behaved as if nothing unusual had occurred. Thornton left Uvalde the following day. County records indicate he never returned to the area, conducting future business through intermediaries. When contacted by Thomas Burrell during his 1967 investigation, Thornton, then in his 90s, refused to discuss Fisher at all. "Some doors are best left closed," was his only comment. In the weeks leading up to his death, Fisher's behavior reportedly became increasingly erratic. The county judge, William Oden, noted in his personal journal that Fisher had requested an unusual legal document, a will that specified elaborate burial instructions. He insists his coffin be lined with lead, Oden wrote. Most curious is his insistence that a silver mirror be placed face down on his chest before burial, and that his hands be bound with silver wire. When I inquired as to the purpose of these arrangements, he replied, "Insurance." Against what, he would not say. Fisher also began spending long hours in the county records office, reviewing old maps of Uvalde and surrounding counties. The clerk reported that he seemed particularly interested in unmarked structures and abandoned properties. On several occasions, he requested information about the locations of old wells, mine shafts, and natural caves in the region. A local rancher, Henry Matthews, encountered Fisher during this period at an abandoned silver mine 20 miles outside of town. Matthews later told Sheriff Woodall, found him standing at the entrance, staring into the darkness. He had a lantern, but it wasn't lit. When I asked his business, he claimed to be investigating reports of squatters. No such reports had been filed, to my knowledge. What struck me was how he kept looking over his shoulder like he expected someone to be behind him. Before riding off, he asked if I'd ever heard voices coming from the mine shaft. Not human voices, he clarified, something older. I advised him the mine had been sealed for good reason. Dangerous gases. He smiled at that. Some things, he said, can't be stopped by a few boards and nails. On March 10, 1884, the day before his death, Fisher visited the Uvalde General Store. The proprietor later recalled that he purchased an unusual combination of items: a small silver hand mirror, 5 pounds of salt, and a length of silver-plated chain. He seemed agitated, the shopkeeper noted, kept looking over his shoulder at the door. Before leaving, he asked me a strange question. "Do you ever feel like you're being followed by something you can't see?" I didn't know how to answer. That same evening, Fisher paid an unexpected visit to Reverend Mitchell at the Uvalde Methodist Church. The minister recorded the encounter in his journal. Deputy Fisher appeared at the parsonage near midnight, requesting to speak in private. He declined to enter the church itself, preferring to remain on the porch. His manner was highly disturbed. "Do you believe a man can inherit evil, Reverend?" he asked. "Not the tendency toward sin that we all share, but something more tangible, a specific evil passed down like an heirloom?" Before I could respond, he continued, "My father opened a door that should have remained closed. What came through has followed me all my life. Tomorrow, I believe it will finally catch up to me." He refused prayer or counsel, stating it was far too late for that. As he departed, he handed me a sealed envelope with instructions that it be opened only in the event of his death. I placed it in the church safe. The envelope was never found. When Burrell interviewed Mitchell's successor in 1967, he learned that the church safe had been destroyed in a fire in 1887. All contents had been lost. The timing of the fire, exactly 3 years after Fisher's death, may have been coincidental, but Burrell noted it as an unsettling symmetry in his research notes. On March 11, 1884, King Fisher traveled to San Antonio with Uvalde County Sheriff Ben Woodall. According to official reports, they attended a theatrical performance at the Vaudeville Theater. During the show, an altercation broke out, and both men were killed in the ensuing gunfire. The shooter was identified as gambler Jim King, who was reportedly settling an old score with Woodall. Fisher, authorities claimed, was simply caught in the crossfire. The San Antonio Daily Express reported the incident as a typical frontier shooting. Their March 12th edition stated, "Violence erupted at the Vaudeville Theater last night when gambler Jim King, long known to harbor a grudge against Uvalde Sheriff Woodall, opened fire during the second act of The Count of Monte Cristo. Sheriff Woodall and his deputy, the reformed outlaw King Fisher, were both struck multiple times. Witnesses report that King approached the lawman from behind and fired without warning. The theater fell into pandemonium as patrons rushed for exits. King was apprehended at the scene. What the newspaper failed to mention, but was recorded in the official police report, was the unusual nature of the wounds. The medical examiner noted that while Woodall had been shot in the conventional manner, 3 bullets to the back, Fisher's wounds followed a peculiar pattern. Subject received 4 shots, the report reads, 1 to each knee, 1 to the right hand, and 1 to the throat. Pattern suggests the shooter deliberately immobilized the victim before administering the fatal shot. This indicates a level of premeditation inconsistent with a chance encounter. The medical examiner, Dr. Frederick Holcomb, included a personal observation in his notes that was omitted from the official report. Of particular interest is the state of rigor mortis in Fisher's case. Despite being deceased for approximately the same period as Sheriff Woodall, Fisher's body showed significantly more advanced rigor. Additionally, I observed that the bullet wounds exhibited minimal bleeding compared to what would be expected. It was almost as if the body had been partially exsanguinated prior to the shooting. Most peculiar was the expression frozen on Fisher's face, not surprise or pain as one might expect, but what appeared to be relief. More telling was the testimony of theater usher Edward Smalley, preserved in the San Antonio Police Archives, but never published. Smalley stated, "The man they're calling Jim King entered the theater 20 minutes before the victims. He took a seat directly behind them, though the house was half empty and better seats were available. He did not watch the stage at all, but kept his eyes fixed on the back of Fisher's head. Most peculiar was that when he finally stood to shoot, he addressed Fisher by name. 'I found you,' he said, 'just like you found me.' Only then did he draw his weapon." Another witness, Elizabeth Thornton, provided additional details in her statement to police. "Before the shooting, I observed Mr. Fisher behaving strangely. He kept looking around the theater, particularly at the empty balcony above. At one point he stood abruptly as if to leave, but the sheriff pulled him back to his seat. I distinctly heard Fisher say, 'They're here, all of them.' The sheriff appeared to dismiss his concerns. Moments later, the man behind them stood and fired his weapon." Jim King himself provided no clarification. After his arrest, he remained silent during interrogation. The only statement attributed to him in police records is cryptic. Ask Fisher if he remembers Collin County. Ask him what's still in the cellar. King was held in the San Antonio jail awaiting trial, but was found dead in his cell 3 days after the shooting. The death was ruled a suicide, though the method was unusual. He had apparently driven a piece of metal from his bed frame through his own eye. No suicide note was found. The jail guard who discovered King's body, Michael Sullivan, later told a San Antonio Express reporter details that were omitted from official reports. The cell was ice cold when I found him, though it was a warm March night. Strangest thing was the walls. They were covered with the same word written over and over in what looked like blood, hungry. When I returned with the coroner less than 10 minutes later, the writing was gone. Cell was clean as a whistle, though still cold enough to see your breath. Never experienced anything like it in 20 years of guard duty. Another prisoner, held in the cell adjacent to King's, reported hearing unusual sounds the night of the suicide. In a statement given to police but never made public, he claimed, around midnight King started talking, though there was no one else there. He kept saying, "I did what you asked. I sent him to you. Now, leave me be." Then he started screaming. Not words, just this terrible sound. The screaming stopped suddenly, and I heard something moving in his cell. Didn't sound like a man walking, more like something dragging itself across the floor. Then silence, until the guard found him in the morning. The bodies were returned to Uvalde for burial. The funeral was sparsely attended. Sarah Fisher, conspicuously absent, had reportedly left town the day after her husband's death. No forwarding address was provided. The house remained empty for years afterward. Local children claimed it was haunted, though their parents discouraged such talk. Eliza Carpenter, who lived next door to the Fisher residence, told the Uvalde newspaper in 1885 that she had encountered Sarah Fisher on the night following King's death. She came to my door well after midnight, dressed for travel, carrying a small valise. She appeared calm but determined. "If he comes looking," she told me, "tell him I went east." When I asked who might come looking, she replied, "You'll know him by his eyes. They're the same as King's." She left on the eastbound train at dawn. I never saw her again. What Carpenter did not share publicly, but later confided to her daughter, was what she observed after Sarah's departure. "I watched from my window as dawn broke," she reportedly said. A strange mist formed around the Fisher house. Not natural fog, but something that seemed to cling specifically to that building. It lasted maybe 10 minutes, then dissipated as the sun rose. Later that day, I noticed all the birds had vanished from the property. No sparrows in the eaves, no mockingbirds in the oak tree. That silence lasted for months. Even now, 2 years later, animals avoid the place. It's as if they know something we don't. Fisher's funeral proceeded according to his unusual instructions. The county mortician's records confirm that his coffin was indeed lined with lead. A silver mirror was placed on his chest, and his hands were bound with silver wire. The mortician noted, "These preparations were specified in legal documents and carried out despite their irregular nature." Most unusual was the layer of salt placed beneath the body before the coffin was sealed. No explanation was provided for these arrangements. The mortician, Samuel Graves, later shared additional observations with his apprentice, who recorded them in a journal discovered in 1959. Mr. Graves confided that he had never seen a corpse like Fisher's, the apprentice wrote. Though dead only 2 days, the body showed advanced signs of decay inconsistent with the environmental conditions. More disturbing was what Mr. Graves described as movement beneath the skin, like something crawling underneath. He completed the preparations in unusual haste and sealed the coffin immediately, refusing to discuss the matter further. The burial itself was conducted with unusual haste. Reverend Thomas Mitchell, who presided over the service, wrote in his church record, "Briefest funeral in my 20 years of ministry. No eulogy was permitted. The coffin remained closed throughout. In attendance were 3 county officials and 1 unidentified man who stood apart from the others. This individual departed immediately after the coffin was lowered, riding north at great speed." Most curious was the condition of the grave itself, which had been lined with what appeared to be iron plates before the coffin was placed. Mitchell's personal diary, discovered after his death in 1902, contained a more candid assessment. "I cannot escape the feeling that today we buried something other than a man. Throughout the service, I experienced a profound sense of dread unlike anything in my ministerial career. Most troubling was the moment the coffin was lowered into the grave. I distinctly heard what sounded like scratching from within, as if something was trying to get out. When I mentioned this to the cemetery workers, they claimed to have heard nothing, though the pallor of their faces suggested otherwise. I have instructed my wife that under no circumstances am I to be buried in proximity to Fisher's grave. In 1967, when Thomas Burrell began his research into King Fisher, he found several troubling inconsistencies. The San Antonio police report listed 4 shots fired, yet the coroner's record showed 7 bullet wounds between the 2 victims. Fisher's body had been embalmed before being returned to Uvalde, an unusual expense at that time. Most disturbing was a telegram sent from San Antonio to the Uvalde telegraph office the day before the shooting. The recipient's name was smudged, but the message read only, "Tomorrow night," as discussed. Burrell also discovered that the man identified as Jim King had no documented existence prior to the shooting. No gambling associates came forward to claim acquaintance with him. No records of previous arrests or known addresses could be found. It was as if he had materialized solely for the purpose of killing Fisher, then vanished just as mysteriously through his alleged suicide. Burrell's investigation took him to Fisher's former ranch in Dimmitt County, by then long abandoned. Local ranchers avoided the property, claiming the soil there wouldn't support grass, and cattle refused to graze near the old house foundation. Burrell spent 3 days on the property. In his notes, he recorded finding a small cellar beneath what had been the main house. Inside, the walls were covered with tally marks scratched into the stone. He did not speculate on their meaning. More disturbing was his discovery near the site where Fisher had reportedly buried the remains of the burned room. Burrell's journal entry from May 14, 1967 reads, "Excavated to a depth of approximately 6 feet at the location, indicated by local sources. Soil heavily mixed with salt, which has prevented normal decomposition processes. Uncovered what appears to be a wooden box approximately 3 feet square. The wood has been preserved by the salt. The box is bound with multiple iron bands and appears to have been sealed with some type of resin or tar. Did not attempt to open it. Reburied at same location. Some things are not meant to be disturbed." A subsequent entry, dated May 15th, suggests Burrell may have reconsidered his decision. Returned to excavation site at dawn, found the ground disturbed. Someone had been digging during the night. The box was partially uncovered, its sealed lid now cracked open approximately 1 inch. No footprints or other evidence of human activity visible in the surrounding soil. Peered into the opening, but could discern only darkness. As I knelt beside the box, I distinctly heard what sounded like whispering emanating from within, not words I could understand, but clearly vocalization of some kind. Filled the hole completely and marked the location with a cairn of stones. Will not return to this site. The most significant discovery came when Burrell located Sarah Fisher's younger sister in a small town near Houston. The woman, then in her 70s, claimed Sarah had contacted her once after Fisher's death. According to the sister, Sarah had been living under an assumed name in Louisiana. Before ending communication permanently, she had sent a package containing only her wedding ring and a note that read, "He will find me if I keep this. He finds everyone eventually." The sister, identified in Burrell's notes as Eleanor Vivian, provided additional context. Sarah wrote that Fisher had come to her town in East Texas specifically to find her. She hadn't understood why at first. He courted her with unusual intensity, and within a month they were married. It was only later that she realized he had been searching for someone with a specific quality. "He believes I can see them too," she wrote to me, "the things that follow him, the things he says he inherited from his father's house." When I asked her what things she meant, she would only say, "The hungry ones." Vivian shared one final letter she had received from her sister, postmarked from Alexandria, Louisiana, in 1885. "King is gone, but not what came with him from that cellar in Collin County. He thought he could control them with his rituals and offerings. He was wrong. They were using him all along. Now they're looking for a new host. I see signs of them everywhere, in reflections, in shadows, in the corner of my eye. They're patient, Eleanor. They can wait decades if necessary. If you ever meet a man with eyes like kings, empty yet somehow hungry, run. Don't look back. Some legacies can't be escaped, only passed along. When Burrell attempted to access Fisher's official records as deputy sheriff, he found that many had been damaged in a courthouse basement flood in 1891. The surviving documents showed that during Fisher's tenure as deputy, the county experienced an unusual number of vagrant arrests. Most concerning was the pattern of these arrests: individuals with no local connections who were passing through the area. Court records showed they were generally sentenced to small fines or brief jail terms, but prison logs indicated several never left custody. When questioned about these discrepancies, their names were simply removed from the records. The prison warden during this period, Jackson Harlow, had kept a personal logbook separate from official records. This book, discovered by Burrell in the effects of Harlow's granddaughter, contained troubling entries. One, dated September 1882, read, "Fisher came again at midnight, took the drifter from cell 3 to the old storeroom, returned alone 2 hours later. When I asked about the prisoner, he said, 'There never was one.' The cell was empty in the morning. No sign of the man or his belongings. This is the 4th this month." A subsequent entry provided more detail. "Followed Fisher tonight without his knowledge. He took the vagrant to the old storage room in the east wing. Positioned myself by the ventilation grate where I could observe without being seen." What transpired defies rational explanation. Fisher had the man sit in a chair positioned in the center of a circle drawn on the floor, salt, I believe. He placed a mirror behind the chair facing the prisoner. Fisher then produced a small book from his pocket and began reading aloud in a language I did not recognize. The vagrant began to shake violently, then grew completely still. What happened next I hesitate to record, fearing for my own sanity. The man's reflection in the mirror began to move independently of him, stretching and distorting. Fisher continued reading, his voice rising. Then, impossibly, something began to emerge from the mirror, a shadowy form that lacked definite shape. The vagrant screamed once, then fell silent. I fled my observation point, unable to witness more. Fisher found me in my office an hour later. "What you saw stays between us," he said, "unless you want to be next." I have requested transfer to another facility. 3 months into his research, Burrell abruptly stopped his work. He requested all his materials be sealed and placed in storage. When pressed by the Historical Society about his findings, he would only say, "Some stones should remain unturned." He left Uvalde shortly after and died of a heart attack in El Paso in 1968. Among his personal effects was a sealed envelope with instructions that it not be opened until 50 years after his death. When the envelope was finally opened in 2018, it contained only a hand-drawn map of what appeared to be the Fisher Ranch property, with 7 X marks in various locations. No explanation was provided. What had caused Burrell to abandon his research so suddenly? His journal provides one possible clue. His final entry, dated August 8, 1967, reads, "Woke at 3:17 a.m. to find someone standing at the foot of my bed. Though the room was dark, I could clearly see it was a man in old-fashioned clothing. He said nothing, only stared. When I reached for the lamp, he was gone. The air smelled of damp earth and something coppery like old blood. On my dresser this morning, I found a small piece of paper. On it was written a name, my name, in handwriting I do not recognize. Below it, a single word: soon." Burrell's daughter, interviewed in 1975, provided additional context for her father's abrupt cessation of research. "Dad changed after his trip to the Fisher Ranch," she recalled. "He became obsessed with mirrors, covered the one in his bathroom, removed the one from his bedroom entirely. He began sleeping with the lights on and placed what looked like salt across his doorway each night. When I asked about these behaviors, he would only say, 'They travel through reflections, they wait in the dark.' He refused to discuss his research with anyone, even colleagues he had trusted for decades. The night before we left Uvalde, I overheard him on the phone speaking to someone he addressed as Eleanor. All I caught was one phrase. You were right. They're still hungry. In 1969, during the renovation of Fisher's former home in Uvalde, workers discovered a false wall in the cellar. Behind it was a small space containing a wooden chest. According to the contractor's report, the chest held various personal items, a set of silver hairbrushes, several books, and a journal. The journal reportedly belonged to Sarah Fisher. The contractor claimed to have turned these items over to the property owner, but no record exists of what became of them afterward. The property owner, when interviewed by local newspaper, the Uvalde Leader News, denied receiving any such items. One of the workers, however, later admitted to reading portions of the journal before it disappeared. He claimed it contained disturbing entries about Sarah's life with Fisher. According to this account, Sarah wrote that her husband would sometimes stand motionless for hours, staring at nothing. He forbade her to enter certain rooms of the house on specific days. Most unsettling were her descriptions of the questions he asked her repeatedly. Do you hear them too? And have they found us yet? The worker, identified only as Rodriguez in subsequent interviews, provided more details about the journal's contents. Mrs. Fisher wrote that her husband maintained what he called a calendar of visitations. Certain dates were marked in red ink. On these days, he would lock himself in the root cellar from sunset to sunrise. She described hearing his voice through the floor, though it sounded as if he were speaking to someone else. Once, she claimed, she heard another voice responding, like sand being poured over glass, was how she described it. Rodriguez also recalled entries describing Fisher's nightmares. According to his wife, Fisher rarely slept more than 2 hours at a stretch. He would wake screaming about the cellar back home and what father kept there. Most disturbing were his claims that something had followed him from Collin County, something that wore the faces of the dead and was always hungry. The journal reportedly contained a detailed account of an incident that occurred in January 1884, just months before Fisher's death. Sarah described waking in the night to find her husband gone from their bed. Following sounds to the root cellar, she observed him through a crack in the trapdoor. He knelt in the center of a circle of salt, she wrote. Before him stood a mirror, and beside it a small iron cage containing a rat. As I watched, he cut his palm with a silver knife and let blood drip onto the mirror's surface. The glass appeared to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. Then, impossibly, a hand emerged from the mirror. Not human, too elongated, fingers too numerous. It reached for the cage which King pushed forward. The rat's squeals were briefly terrible, then silent. The hand withdrew. King spoke to the mirror. Is it enough? Will it satisfy you until the new moon? A voice answered, though I could not comprehend the words. My husband replied, I know, but I cannot keep feeding you strangers. People are noticing. The response from the mirror made him tremble. Then give me time, he said. I'll find another way. When he turned toward the trapdoor, I fled. The worker also claimed the journal's final entry, dated March 10, 1884, the day before Fisher's death, read simply, He knows I've seen it. God help me. What will become of me now? Rodriguez himself became increasingly reluctant to discuss the journal as years passed. When approached by a researcher in 1978, he refused to speak further on the subject, saying only, some things should stay buried. I've said too much already. He moved from Uvalde shortly after and reportedly refused to return to the town for any reason, even declining to attend his own daughter's wedding when it was held there in 1983. What remained unrecorded in official accounts was what happened to Rodriguez in the weeks following his discovery of the journal. His son, interviewed in 1992, claimed that his father began experiencing vivid nightmares after reading Sarah Fisher's writings. He would wake up screaming about people with no faces, the son recalled. He claimed someone was watching him from mirrors, not his own reflection, but something else that moved when he stood still. He covered every reflective surface in our house with cloth. The night before we left Uvalde, he burned something in the backyard, papers or a book, I couldn't tell which. It's the only way to break the connection, he told me. He never spoke of Fisher again, not once in the remaining 20 years of his life. Fisher's grave in the Uvalde Cemetery remains a subject of local controversy. In 1952, a groundskeeper reported that the earth around the headstone had sunken dramatically overnight, creating what appeared to be a cavity beneath the grave. Cemetery officials filled the depression with soil, but it reportedly reappeared several times in subsequent years. Eventually, a concrete slab was placed over the gravesite to prevent further incidents. Martin Greaves, who served as cemetery caretaker from 1949 to 1967, provided a more detailed account in a recorded interview with the Uvalde Historical Society. It wasn't just that the earth sank, he explained. It was the way it happened, like something had pushed up from below, not just settled, and there were marks in the dirt, narrow grooves, like something had been dragging itself around. Found them leading from the grave to the cemetery gate 3 mornings in a row. After we put down the concrete, they stopped. But every year, on the anniversary of his burial, that slab sweats. Beads of moisture form on the surface, even in dry weather. Never happens to any other grave. Greaves also described an incident that occurred in 1957, which he had previously kept to himself. I was closing the cemetery at dusk when I noticed someone standing by Fisher's grave, a tall man in old-fashioned clothes. I called out, thinking it was a visitor I'd overlooked during closing rounds. He didn't respond, just kept staring down at the grave. As I approached, he looked up at me. His face, I still have trouble describing it. It seemed to shift, like it couldn't settle on one appearance. Sometimes I remember it as gaunt, sometimes bloated, sometimes hardly a face at all. I blinked, and he was gone. That night, my wife said I called out a name in my sleep, over and over. Job. I've never known anyone by that name. The true nature of King Fisher, outlaw, lawman, and perhaps something far more disturbing, remains obscured by time and deliberate silence. Those who knew him best left few records of their experiences. Those who sought to understand him often abandoned their search. What is clear is that, in the harsh landscape of frontier Texas, Fisher created a legacy of fear that extended well beyond his lifetime. The San Antonio Theater where Fisher died was demolished in 1927. During the excavation for the new building, workers discovered a sealed metal box in the foundation. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing 5 names, including John King Fisher. The other 4 names belonged to individuals who had disappeared from various Texas counties between 1876 and 1883. All 4 had last been seen in the vicinity of Uvalde County. The document bore no signature or explanation. Robert Garza, the construction foreman who found the box, provided additional details that were not included in official reports. There was something else in that box, he told his grandson, who later recounted the story to local historians. A small cloth bag containing what looked like human teeth, 5 of them, and a folded piece of paper with the same message written over and over, "Not enough, never enough." The site manager took these items and told us never to mention them. The next day, that part of the foundation was filled with concrete, though the work wasn't scheduled to be completed for another week. In the decades since, various researchers have attempted to piece together the full story of King Fisher. Some have reported strange occurrences during their investigations. Missing documents, unexplained equipment failures, and in one case from 1963, the sudden onset of debilitating nightmares that ended only when the research was abandoned. Dr. Eleanor Harding, a historian from the University of Texas, who began researching Fisher in 1957, documented her experiences in a private journal discovered after her death in 1965. "The more I learn about Fisher, the more I sense I am being watched," she wrote. "Twice now I have returned to my office to find my research papers rearranged. The janitor claims no one has entered the room. Most disturbing was finding a name added to my list of research contacts, my own name, written in an unfamiliar hand, with yesterday's date beside it. I find myself reluctant to continue this work, though I cannot articulate why." Her final entry, dated 2 days before her unexpected death from what was officially ruled a stroke, reads, "Dreamed of Collin County last night. A farmhouse partially hidden by trees, a cellar door chained shut. Something scratching on the other side trying to get out. A voice calling my name. Woke to find my bedroom mirror had fallen from the wall and shattered. Among the fragments was a small tooth, human but oddly misshapen. I have decided to abandon this research permanently. Some mysteries should remain unsolved. The university colleague who discovered Harding's body reported finding her seated at her desk, facing a small hand mirror. According to his statement to police, her expression was one of absolute terror, as if she had seen something in that reflection that defied comprehension. The mirror itself was cracked down the center, though there was no evidence it had been dropped or struck. Perhaps most telling is what happened to Sarah Fisher after she fled Uvalde. County records from Calcasieu Parish, Louisiana, show that a woman matching her description died in a boarding house fire in 1887. The boarding house owner told authorities that in the weeks before her death, the woman had boarded up her room's windows and placed salt across the threshold of her door. When asked why, she reportedly said, "He can find anyone, but some things slow him down." The night of the fire, multiple witnesses reported seeing a lone rider approach the boarding house shortly before the flames were spotted. No one could provide a clear description of the rider, who was never identified or located for questioning. The parish coroner's report noted that the fire appeared to have started in the victim's room, though no lamp or stove was present that might have caused it. Most unsettling was the condition of the body, which the coroner described as extensively damaged beyond what the fire alone would cause. He noted specifically that the hands and face appear to have been subjected to much greater heat than the rest of the remains, rendering identification by conventional means impossible. The boarding house owner, Matilda Robichaud, later told the parish priest that she had discovered something strange when cleaning out the room before the fire. The woman had been writing something on the walls behind her bed, Robichaud stated. Same words, over and over. He is not alone. When I asked her about it, she said, "They're hungry. They're always hungry, and he feeds them." In 1889, a Texas ranger named James Brooks, who had documented Fisher's activities years earlier, traveled to Louisiana to investigate the fire. His official report has been lost, but a letter to his superior, preserved in the Texas Ranger archives, contains a disturbing observation. "I believe the woman who died was indeed Sarah Fisher. What troubles me is the pattern of the fire. According to local accounts, it burned in a perfect circle, centered on her room. Everything within that circle was reduced to ash, while structures just feet away remained untouched. I am reminded of what King Fisher once told me years ago when I asked why he had reformed. Some things can't be outrun, Ranger. They follow by scent. The only choice is to keep moving or feed them someone else." I did not understand his meaning then. I fear I do now. Brooks never returned to active duty after his investigation in Louisiana. He resigned from the Rangers within a month of his return to Texas. According to family accounts, he moved to a remote property in the Davis Mountains, where he lived as a virtual hermit until his death in 1905. His cabin reportedly had no mirrors or other reflective surfaces, and the windows were covered with heavy curtains that remained drawn even during daylight hours. Today, the lands once owned by King Fisher have been divided and developed. Houses stand where he once ruled through fear. Families live their lives unaware of what occurred on that soil nearly a century and a half ago. But occasionally, residents report unusual experiences, unexplained footsteps, the sensation of being watched, and dreams of a man standing silently at the foot of their beds, just watching. In 1969, an elderly man in a San Antonio nursing home claimed to have been one of Fisher's ranch hands in his youth. In a recorded interview, his last before his death, he said only, "There were rules with King, never mention certain names in his presence, never ask about the sounds from the cellar, and most important, if he asked you to dig a hole, you dug it without asking why. Then you forgot you ever dug it at all." The interviewer asked what happened to those who broke these rules. The old man fell silent for so long that the recorder ran out of tape. When the interviewer changed the cassette, the man simply said, "I'm still alive, aren't I?" He refused to speak further on the subject. The interviewer, graduate student Michael Canfield, later wrote in his thesis notes, "After the formal interview ended, the subject beckoned me closer and whispered something that I initially dismissed as the ramblings of an old man. Fisher found a way to feed them without being taken himself," he said. "That's why he became a lawman." No one questions when prisoners disappear from a jail cell. No one investigates when drifters go missing. When I asked who they were, he grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. "The hungry ones," he said, "the ones his father called up from the dark, the ones that wore his mother's face after she died." He would say nothing more, but that night the nursing home reported he refused to sleep, insisting his bed be moved to the center of the room, with salt poured around it in a circle. Canfield himself became increasingly interested in Fisher's story. His doctoral dissertation, filed in 1972, focused on law enforcement in post-Civil War Texas, with a substantial section devoted to Fisher's transformation from outlaw to deputy sheriff. In 1974, he traveled to Collin County to investigate the original Fisher property. County records showed the land had changed hands multiple times since the 1870s, with no structures remaining from that period. A local historian, Margaret Wheeler, guided Canfield to what was believed to be the original location of the Fisher farmhouse. In correspondence discovered after his disappearance in 1975, Canfield wrote to a colleague, "Nothing remains of the house itself, not even a foundation. The land has been cultivated for decades. What I found disturbing was the small area in the approximate location of the cellar that remains barren." Wheeler claims no crops will grow there, regardless of soil treatments. Local farmers avoid the spot. When I knelt to examine the soil, I found it unusually damp, despite recent drought conditions. More curious was the small object I uncovered just beneath the surface, what appears to be a child's tooth, darkened with age, but preserved by some quality in the soil. I have decided to extend my stay to conduct a more thorough examination of the site. Canfield was reported missing 3 days later. His rental car was found parked at a motel in McKinney, his belongings untouched inside his room. The only item missing was a small box containing the tooth he had discovered. Despite an extensive search, no trace of him was ever found. The case remains open. As the sun sets over the Texas brush country, the legacy of King Fisher remains, not in monuments or history books, but in the persistent whispers of those who still study his life. In the quiet corners of Uvalde County, his name is rarely spoken aloud. Some stories are best left untold, some mysteries best left unsolved. But for those who listen carefully, the echoes of that time can still be heard. In the wind through the mesquite, in the silence of an empty room, in the spaces between the official records where the truth lies, buried, waiting. Perhaps that is King Fisher's final legacy. Not what is known about him, but what remains hidden. Not what was recorded, but what was deliberately omitted. In the shadowy borderland between documented history and suppressed truth, his story continues to unsettle those who encounter it. Like the 7 unmarked locations on Burrell's map, some secrets remain in the ground, undisturbed but not forgotten. In 1957, a well was dug on property that once formed part of Fisher's Dimmitt County Ranch. At a depth of 30 feet, workers reported finding a layer of salt-encrusted soil, and beneath it, what appeared to be a small wooden box. The property owner, Manuel Sanchez, ordered the box brought to the surface. According to his son, who later recounted the incident to local historians, the box contained a single sheet of paper bearing the names of 7 individuals, all unknown to Sanchez. The last name on the list was King Fisher, followed by the notation, "Not yet." That night, Sanchez reportedly woke to find a man standing in his bedroom doorway. Though the room was dark, he could see the figure clearly, like he brought his own darkness with him, Sanchez later told his son. The figure said nothing, only watched. When Sanchez called out, it vanished. The following morning, Sanchez ordered the box reburied and the well filled in. He sold the property within the month and moved his family to California. When contacted by researchers in 1968, he refused to discuss the incident, saying only, "Some things should stay buried." In 2015, during highway expansion near Uvalde, construction workers uncovered what appeared to be an unmarked burial site. Archaeological examination revealed the remains of 5 individuals estimated to have been interred in the early 1880s. The bodies showed no obvious cause of death, but all shared an unusual characteristic. Each had a silver coin placed in the mouth and iron bands around the wrists. No official record of these burials existed. The location corresponded to one of the marked spots on Burrell's map. After documentation, the remains were reinterred in the Uvalde Cemetery, deliberately distant from Fisher's grave. The lead archaeologist, Dr. Oz, James Thornton, noted in his report that the soil surrounding the remains contained an unusually high concentration of salt. More puzzling was his observation that, despite the estimated time of burial being approximately 140 years ago, the remains exhibited a curious state of preservation, particularly the soft tissues of the hands and face, which showed significantly less decomposition than would be expected. Thornton resigned from the project shortly after filing his preliminary findings, citing personal reasons. His final report was completed by a colleague. And somewhere, in archives and attics, in memories and nightmares, the full truth of King Fisher waits, a truth that may never see the light of day. Perhaps, as Thomas Burrell suggested, that is for the best, for some hungers, once awakened, can never be satisfied, and some legacies, once inherited, can never be escaped.